Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're exploring the fascinating world of workplace dynamics. All those disagreements and conflicts that seem to pop up, and of course the contracts that kind of shape our work lives. We'll be using workplace dispute resolution and employment contracts explained as our main source for this one. And it's funny, this source starts off with a pretty wild story about how, like, a tiny splinter in someone's knee actually turned into this huge workplace dispute. It ended up becoming a full-blown union grievance. Can you believe that?
It does sound a little bit crazy, right? Like something out of a sitcom or something.
Hmm.
But it really does highlight something super important. Even these seemingly small issues, the things we might just brush off, can actually escalate really quickly if they're not handled well. And, the source actually gives a pretty simple definition of a grievance. It says it's basically any complaint that an employee makes about feeling like something's unfair at work.
Okay, so that's pretty broad, right? That could be almost anything. It makes me think about, we've all heard those stories about like the classic splinter scenario, right?
Yeah.
But what about those less obvious grievances? The things managers might face every day, like disagreements about performance reviews or how companies handle remote work policies. Those could be pretty tricky too.
Absolutely. Those are prime examples. And the research that they cite in this source really emphasizes just how important a manager's skills are in those situations. They're the ones who need to stop those little sparks from becoming major fires. And there's this great quote from a senior HR executive at ANZ. He says, "What we have done quite consciously is to build better communications with our staff, direct relationships face-to-face with our staff for matters that affect them in the workplace, and there is no substitute for that."
I think that direct communication is so crucial. I had this experience once where there was just this simple misunderstanding about a deadline. But because we were only using email to communicate, it just snowballed into this huge conflict. We could have avoided the whole thing if we just picked up the phone and talked it out.
Oh, yeah, classic example, right? And that's exactly why this source really emphasizes having a clear process for dealing with grievances.
Mm.
Taking them seriously, listening actively, trying to establish all the facts, but above all, remaining calm. They even have this little warning in there about how lost tempers and accusations only make things worse. Just fuel those bad feelings.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Nobody makes good decisions when they're in the heat of the moment.
Yeah. It's not just about putting out fires, right? This source also talks about the importance of natural justice. What exactly does that mean in a workplace setting? That's a really good point. It's a core part of handling grievance as well. Basically, it means making sure that everyone involved gets a fair hearing and that any decisions made are completely impartial. So it's not just about resolving the immediate conflict. It's also about maintaining a sense of fairness in the workplace overall, making sure everyone feels like they're being treated fairly. But even with the best processes in place, some conflicts just require extra careful handling. And one of those is workplace bullying.
That's a really good point to bring up because this source actually goes into some pretty shocking statistics about the impact of bullying. It mentions a report from the Australian Human Rights Commission. And get this, they estimate that bullying costs the Australian economy somewhere between $6 and $36 billion every single year.
Yeah, those numbers are pretty eye-opening, right? It really shows you just how big of a problem this is and why it's so important to address it proactively. And it's important to remember that we're not just talking about, like schoolyard teasing here.
Yeah.
This source actually defines bullying as a whole range of harmful behaviors. So things like yelling or using offensive language, isolating people from their colleagues, giving them impossible tasks to complete, or even assigning them meaningless work just to make them feel useless. All of those things can count as bullying.
Wow, it's kind of disturbing when you see those specific examples laid out like that. It really makes you think. Have you ever encountered any of these behaviors yourself? I mean, I've definitely seen some of them firsthand, and it's never a good experience.
It's definitely more common than we'd like to think. And the source also points out that the costs go way beyond just the financial impact. They talk about these hidden and lost opportunity costs, which I think really speaks to the damage that bullying can do to individuals, to teams, and even to the entire culture of an organization.
Yeah, it's like this ripple effect that can touch everything from productivity to employee morale. So we've talked about conflict resolution and the very real problem of bullying. But now I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about the agreements that kind of underpin our work lives. Those employment contracts that we all sign.
Right, and to help explain the different types of contracts, this source actually uses a really interesting analogy. They say, imagine that your business management class actually gets to negotiate their own working conditions with the teacher. It's like a real-world simulation.
Okay, I love that idea. It's so much more engaging than just diving straight into all the legal jargon. So let's play this out for a minute. How would this classroom simulation work? with something like an enterprise agreement?
Well, in this scenario, you'd have all the students coming together. Maybe they even form like a little student union, and then they would collectively bargain with the teacher who's representing the employer. They'd negotiate things like homework policies, rules for the classroom, maybe even the grading system.
So it's all about finding a compromise that works for both sides, right? In this case, the students who are like the employees and the teacher who's the employer.
Exactly. And that agreement they come up with, that's the enterprise agreement. And it would apply to every single student in that classroom, just like a real enterprise agreement applies to everyone in a specific workplace.
Okay, that makes sense. So then how would this play out differently with an individual contract? Is it like that one student who always tries to cut a deal with the teacher to get extra credit or something?
That's actually a perfect example. An individual contract is all about tailoring the terms to a specific employee. So in our classroom scenario, it might be that one student negotiating a unique arrangement with the teacher. Maybe they agree to do extra homework assignments in exchange for not having to do as many class presentations.
So it's like those secret deals that the source talks about where the terms of the contract are confidential. I have to admit that does sound kind of intriguing.
It definitely has its appeal, especially for people who have unique skills or circumstances. But the source points out that these individual contracts are more common in professional and managerial roles. So think like senior executives or specialists who might have very specific needs that wouldn't be covered by a standard enterprise agreement.
Yeah, that makes sense. You wouldn't expect the CEO of a company to have the same contract as someone just starting out in an entry-level position.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of individual contracts brings up some interesting questions. Like, what are the potential downsides of this secret deal approach? And how do these individual contracts compare to the collective bargaining power that you get with an enterprise agreement? Those are some really good questions.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a kind of trade-off happening, right? You might get more flexibility and maybe even a better deal if you negotiate individually, but then you lose some of that transparency and that collective bargaining power that you get with an enterprise agreement.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's all about balance. And to really understand those trade-offs, it helps to think about the historical context. Enterprise bargaining or collective agreement making, it all came about because workers wanted to improve their working conditions. They needed a way to band together and have a stronger voice when they were negotiating with employers, level the playing field a bit.
So it was really a fight for workers' rights, right? Strength in numbers.
Yep.
It really makes you appreciate how much those struggles shaped the workplace we have today.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? Those dynamics, they're still changing today. The whole balance between individual rights and collective bargaining, it's an ongoing conversation. But to get back to your question about the pros and cons, let's start by talking about enterprise agreements. I think one of the biggest advantages is that they create this clear, consistent set of standards for everyone in the workplace. It creates a sense of fairness and transparency because everybody knows what to expect. And from a practical standpoint, it's way more efficient than trying to negotiate individual contracts with every single employee.
Right. I can imagine that streamlines things a lot for both sides. But you mentioned flexibility as being a key benefit of individual contracts. How does that actually play out in real life?
Well, individual contracts, they can be really tailored to a specific employee's skills, experience, and needs. So it can be a really attractive option for people in highly specialized roles, the kind of people who might be able to negotiate better terms for themselves than they would get under a standard agreement.
So there's more potential for them to have control over their own career path and how much they get paid.
Yeah.
But what about those downsides we're talking about? The lack of transparency and maybe having less bargaining power. Are those things a major concern?
Definitely. Those are things to consider, With individual contracts, you don't have the collective power of a union behind you. And that confidentiality aspect, those secret deals, they can sometimes lead to suspicion and resentment among employees if it seems like certain people are getting preferential treatment.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike.
Yeah.
You gain flexibility on one hand, but then you might be giving up some security and transparency on the other. It seems like choosing the right approach really depends on each person's individual circumstances and priorities.
Exactly. There's no one right answer for everyone. But hopefully this deep dive has at least given you a better understanding of how things work in the workplace. From those little disagreements that pop up to those bigger agreements that shape our whole work lives.
I think it's definitely given me a lot to think about. And to all of our listeners out there, we'll leave you with one final thought. Considering everything we've talked about today, what do you think are the most important factors to weigh when you're deciding between a collective agreement and an individual contract? What would work best for you? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, But it's definitely a conversation worth having as you navigate your own career path.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of workplace dynamics. We'll see you next time.